Welcome to episode 20 of Norse Myths, Legends, and Folktales. My name is MyLinda Butterworth, and today we learn how Thor decides that summer is a good time to make a journey to Utgard to flex his muscles against the giants, with Loki as his companion, in part 1 of Thor's journey to Utgard. Thor said summer was open season, and he announced his plan of making a journey east into Utgard and flexing himself against the giants. "However few they are," he said, "they are too many." "In Utgard," said Loki, "you'll need sharp wits." "Sharp wits," repeated Thor seriously. "And yours are as blunt as your hammer," said Loki, winking at Thor. "Why not take me?" Thor ignored the insult and accepted the offer. "Evil creature, good companion," he said. Loki's eyes gleamed, now brown, now green, now indigo. His scarred lips parted a little and twisted into a wolfish smile. "Tomorrow, then," said Thor. Very early in the morning, before the sky turned blue and before a cock crowed, Thor had his goats brought in from Thrudvang and harnessed to his chariot. Thor and Loki took their seats, and Thor grasped the reins of twined silver. The chariot rattled across the plains of Asgard, still soaked with dew, and Thor looked lovingly at the halls of the sleeping gods and goddesses, towering hulks, all of them, silent and dreamlike in the ashen light. They passed through the great gate and headed for Midgard, the home of men. All day the charioteer and the trickster rode and talked at ease with each other and the world. And early in the evening they came to a lonely farm, the only building for miles around. It was low-slung and almost as green as the fields surrounding it. The turfed roof seemed to grow out of the ground. "A poor place," said Loki. "What they cannot provide, I will," said Thor, and he pulled up his goats and climbed out of the chariot. The farmer and his wife and their children, Thialfi and Roskva, stepped out of their farmhouse and then started to tremble when they recognized their visitors. "What we want," said Loki, "is food and shelter for the night." "We will gladly give you shelter," said the farmer. "And we can offer very little food. We have," said the wife, "vegetables, pottage, but there's no meat." "Not even a chicken?" said Loki, looking around him. The farmer slowly shook his head. "We'll use my goats then," said Thor. Without ado, he slaughtered both animals and skinned them. Then he cut them into joints and jammed them into the wife's large cauldron. The farmer and his wife, their long-legged son, and their fair daughter felt almost sick with hunger at the thought of such a feast. They kept looking at the meat to see whether it was cooked. Thor spread the skins of his 2 goats some way from the fire. "As you eat," he said, "throw the bones onto the skins." They all sat down together under the stars. "Mind what I said." Thor enjoined them. "Be careful with the bones and throw them all onto the skins." Then they all began to eat. The farmer's son, Thialfi, had gone hungry for so long that he could not bear the thought of wasting good marrow. While Thor was talking to his father, he grasped one thigh bone and quickly split it with his knife and sucked the rich juices from it. Then he tossed it onto the heap of bones covering the skins. After they had eaten, Thor and Loki and the farmer's family were ready to sleep, and they all slept soundly after such a fine meal. Thor was the first one up just before daybreak. He rose and dressed and went out of the farmhouse. Then he took his hammer Mjolnir, raised it over the goatskins, and hallowed them. At once the goat stood up, fully fleshed and bleeding. But as they began to move about, Thor noticed that one goat had a lame hind leg. He hurried back to the farmhouse. "Who?" he shouted, and the walls of the farm trembled so much that they nearly collapsed. The farmer and his wife were shocked out of their sleep and sat straight up in their bed. "Who disobeyed me?" roared Thor. "I can see a thigh bone has been broken." Thor's eyes beetled, and the farmer and his wife and Thialfi and Hrossva cowered. His eyes burned like orange flames, and the family thought their days in Midgard had come to an end. Then, when the thunderer grasped his hammer so that his knuckles turned white, the farmer's wife and Hrossva screamed in terror. "Mercy!" pleaded Thialfi, screwing up his eyes. "Mercy! Mercy!" And the farmer begged, "My land, my farm, everything I own, take them. Take everything I own and spare our lives." If Thor was sometimes furiously angry, he was never angry for long. When he saw how the whole poor family were panic-stricken, the blood stopped racing round his body. "I'll take Thialfi and Hrossva to be my servants," he said roughly, "and that's an end to the matter." Now Thor and Loki were ready to resume their journey. Thor gave the goats and the chariot in the farmer's care. He said he would collect them on his way back, and told Thialfi and Hrossva to come with them to Utgard. For a long time they walked across gently falling land, until at last they came to the girdle of water dividing the world of men from Jotunheim. They stared at the fretful gray water and the mountains beyond, squat tubs and barrels of unfriendly land suppressed by leaden sky. "They could wait until the morning," said Thor. Then they busied themselves with putting most of the contents of their knapsack into their stomachs, and filled with the remains of the previous night's meal and a helping of porridge as well, they slept in the sand beside the rocking ocean. Thor and Loki, Thialfi and Hrossva did not have to walk far along the strand the next morning before they found an old boat, beached and disused. They took it over and hauled it down to the water. The boat reared and kicked forward every time Thor pulled the oars, and by midday they reached the shore of Utgard, a broad strip of land that lay between the water and the mountains. The four travelers beached their boat, and as there was no sign of life along the coast, they headed inland. After a while they came to a forest that stretched so far in both directions that there seemed to be no way around it. So they made their way into it and began to pick their way through it. All afternoon they walked through the shadows, light-headed with hunger and the sweet-smelling pine. The ground was springy underfoot. By the time that the light began to fade late in the evening, they had seen no sign of life, and knew that they would have to go without much food that day, for their own stocks were running low. "We must find somewhere to stay for the night," said Loki. "I wouldn't care to end up as a carrion." "Is Vanir's father so afraid of wolves?" said Thor. He smiled to himself. Restless and fleet of foot, Thialfi ran ahead again and again, scouting out the forest for Thor and Loki and his sister. Now, he came back with the news that he had found a glade not far ahead, with a curious kind of hall standing in the middle of it. When they reached the glade, Thor and Loki walked around the hall. It puzzled them too. Although there seemed to be no door, the whole of one end of the hall was open. The opening was as high as the hall was high, and as wide as it was wide, and the hall itself was enormous. Any of the halls in Asgard, even Valhalla, could have fit inside. "This place will keep the rain off our backs," said Loki, "and here at least the damp will not seep into our bones." The gods, Thialfi and Hrossva, were so worn with traveling all day that, hungry though they were, they very quickly settled and fell asleep. At midnight, however, all four of them were shocked out of their sleep. They heard a terrible growling. The noise grew louder. It grew so loud that the hall began to rock and sway. Thor and Loki and Thialfi and Hrossva started to their feet, and the ground shuddered under them. "An earthquake!" shouted Thor. Thialfi and Hrossva stood wide-eyed. Then they hugged one another. "Let's get out," said Loki. "I don't want to be flattened and stiff as a plank." At this moment, however, the ground stopped shaking. The earth thunder ceased as abruptly as it had begun, and the night was as silent as it had been before. "Outside is no safer than inside," said Thor. "There must be somewhere better than this," replied Loki. "Let us at least get the hang of the place," Thor said. "The known is always better than the unknown." So the four of them groped their way towards the far end of the hall, but the darkness seemed to grow thicker and more stifling with every step they took. They did, however, make one find. A smaller side room led off to the right, about halfway down the vast main hall. "This is better," said Thor. "At least we can make a fight of it here. If it is man or monster, shows its face. Earthquakes, however, are something else." And here is where I end my tale for today. But I'll be back with more tales, many more tales. Until then, my friends, enjoy the journey.